The bar was dimly lit, filled with the thick smell of cigarette smoke and stale beer. The jukebox in the corner played a slow country song, blending into the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles echoed through the quiet night. A lone man walked in. He wasn't from around here. His broad shoulders and upright posture gave him a quiet authority, but he moved without arrogance, just calm confidence. He wore a simple black jacket, jeans, and boots, nothing flashy, nothing that drew attention. He took a seat at the counter, nodding politely to the bartender. But attention found him anyway. In the far corner, a group of bikers sat around a table, their voices loud, their drinks half empty. One of them, a tall man with a scruffy beard and a leather vest covered in patches, nudged his friend. His eyes locked on the newcomer, and a sneer formed on his face. "What's he doing here?" the biker muttered. His friend smirked. "Probably lost. Ain't many like him around these parts." The others laughed under their breath, but their voices were just loud enough. The bartender hesitated for a second before setting down a glass in front of the new customer. "You sure you want to be here, man?" he asked in a low voice. The man didn't react to the question. He simply nodded. "Whiskey." "Neat." His voice was deep, steady. The bartender exhaled, glancing toward the bikers before pouring the drink. The bearded biker pushed back his chair with a loud scrape against the wooden floor. The room seemed to shift as he stood up. A couple of regulars at the bar noticed, eyes darting between him and the stranger. Slowly, he walked over, beer bottle in hand. "You lost?" the biker asked, stopping just a foot away. The man didn't even look at him at first. He lifted his glass and took a slow sip, then finally turned, meeting the biker's gaze. His eyes were sharp, unreadable. "No," he said simply. The biker scoffed, looking back at his friends with an exaggerated grin. "No," he repeated mockingly. "Ain't much of a talker, huh?" Silence stretched between them. The stranger didn't blink, didn't flinch. The biker's grin faded slightly. He wasn't used to this. Most people would have backed down, made some excuse, tried to avoid trouble. But this man, he didn't even seem fazed. The biker's hand tightened around the beer bottle. He tapped it against the bar once, then leaned in closer. "See, fellas like you. They don't tend to stick around in places like this." His voice dropped into something lower, more threatening. "Not if they know what's good for 'em." The stranger exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against his glass. Still no reaction. The biker clenched his jaw, then suddenly slammed the beer bottle down hard on the counter. The glass shattered, sending shards skidding across the wood. A few people in the bar gasped. The bartender took a step back. Still, the stranger didn't move. The biker's face twisted in anger. "You deaf or something?" he growled. Finally, the man set his glass down. He turned fully now, facing the biker with complete stillness. "No," he said again. Then, in a tone so calm it was almost unsettling, he added, "But you're making a mistake." The biker's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his eyes. Then anger. "Oh, am I?" he spat. "And what mistake would that be?" The stranger exhaled through his nose, like he already knew how this was going to end. "You don't know who I am," he said simply. The biker barked a laugh. "Yeah? And who the hell are you supposed to be?" The man looked at him for a long moment, then gave the smallest of smirks. "Someone you don't want to fight." The biker's face twisted in rage. Without thinking, he grabbed the stranger's jacket, yanking him forward. And that was when everything changed. The moment the biker grabbed his jacket, the man moved. It was fast, too fast. In a single, fluid motion, he twisted his wrist and broke free from the grip, stepping to the side as the biker stumbled forward. The crowd barely had time to process what happened before the stranger was standing calmly again, as if nothing had occurred. The biker scowled, shaking off his momentary loss of control. "Oh, you think you're slick, huh?" he spat, his fists clenching. The man didn't respond. He simply stared at him with eyes that seemed to study every detail, his stance, his movements, his aggression. It wasn't fear in his expression. It wasn't even anger. It was something worse. It was complete certainty. The biker lunged forward again, swinging a heavy punch. But the man didn't just dodge, he stepped inside the punch, barely shifting his weight, and the biker's own momentum carried him off balance. The next second, the man gripped his wrist, twisted slightly, and suddenly the biker was on his knees, groaning in pain. A few gasps rippled through the bar. His friends were now paying full attention, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. The bartender swallowed hard. "Hey, let's keep it calm now." But it was too late. One of the other bikers jumped up, knocking his chair back. "Get him," he shouted. 3 men rushed forward. The stranger exhaled softly, already adjusting his footing. This wasn't his first bar fight. It wasn't even his 100th. Who was he? Years ago, Navy SEAL training. The ocean was ice cold, the waves crashing over his head as he struggled to hold his breath. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. "Move it," the instructor's voice roared. He powered through, pushing his body past its limits. His hands were raw, his vision blurred from exhaustion, but he stayed focused. SEAL training wasn't about being the biggest, the strongest, or the fastest. It was about mental toughness. Discipline. Knowing how to handle pressure when the world was collapsing around you. And he had survived it all. He had fought in places where the air smelled of gunpowder and the ground was soaked in sweat and blood. He had taken down enemies in the dead of night with only his hands and his mind. He had been trained to stay calm when others panicked, to remain still when chaos erupted. And now, years later, standing in this bar, facing a few drunk bikers? This was nothing. Back to the present. The first attacker swung wildly. The SEAL sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting just enough to send him crashing face-first into a nearby table. The second lunged forward, but the SEAL dropped low, swept his leg, and sent him sprawling onto the floor. The third hesitated now. He wasn't sure what had just happened. One moment, his friends had the upper hand. The next, they were groaning on the ground. The bar was dead silent. All eyes were on the stranger. The SEAL stood straight again, adjusting his jacket. "I warned you," he said, his voice calm, steady. The lead biker, the first one who had grabbed him, stared in disbelief. His pride wouldn't let him back down. He gritted his teeth, rising slowly to his feet. His hand went to his belt. A switchblade. A few people in the bar gasped. Someone muttered, "Oh, man, that's not smart." But the SEAL? He didn't even flinch. He knew how this would end. The biker flicked the knife open, the steel glinting under the bar's dim lights. "Let's see you dodge this," he sneered. The SEAL tilted his head slightly. He'd dealt with worse. Much worse. And now, he was about to show them all just who he really was. The air in the bar felt heavy, thick with tension. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were locked on the switchblade gleaming under the dim lights. The SEAL stood completely still. His hands were relaxed, his breathing even. But he was watching everything. The way the biker's fingers gripped the handle. The slight tremor in his wrist. The way his stance was just a little off balance. The biker thought he was in control. He had no idea. "You think you're a tough guy, huh?" the biker sneered, twirling the knife. "You should have walked out when you had the chance." The SEAL didn't respond. He had already made his decision. There would be no running, no negotiating. The only way this ended was with the biker on the ground. The biker lunged. It was sloppy. Too much aggression, not enough precision. The SEAL pivoted to the side, letting the blade slice through empty air. The biker grunted, stumbling forward as his own force carried him past his target. The seal didn't give him a second chance. With a sharp, controlled movement, he stepped in and grabbed the biker's wrist. A split second later, the blade was out of his hands, spinning through the air, before clattering onto the floor. The biker barely had time to react before the seal twisted his arm and sent him crashing onto the bar counter. A loud thud echoed through the room. Bottles rattled. A few people gasped. The biker groaned, his cheek pressed against the wood. He tried to push himself up, but the seal tightened his grip, pinning him down. It was over. The other bikers froze. The one still standing hesitated, their bravado replaced with something else, something like fear. For the first time, they realized they had picked the wrong target. The seal let go of the biker, stepping back. "It's done," he said simply. The biker stumbled upright, his face red with humiliation and fury. He turned to his friends, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he snapped. "Get him." That was a mistake. Two more bikers rushed forward. One swung wildly, trying to grab the seal. The other aimed for his ribs with a tight-fisted punch. The seal reacted instantly. He caught the first man's wrist, twisting it just enough to send him off balance. At the same time, he shifted his weight and dodged the second attacker's punch. With one quick motion, he delivered a precise strike to the side of the man's neck, a nerve point. The biker collapsed like a sack of bricks. The last attacker hesitated now, his confidence shaken. The seal fixed him with a steady gaze. "Walk away," he said. "Before you regret it." The biker glanced at his fallen friends, then back at the seal. His jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like he was going to charge anyway. But then, slowly, he stepped back. The fight was over. The bar was silent again. The bartender wiped his hands on a rag, looking between the seal and the groaning bikers on the floor. "Well," he muttered. "That was something. The seal exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He hadn't even broken a sweat. But he wasn't done yet. Because just then, the front door swung open. A voice cut through the tension. "Police! Hands where we can see 'em." The bar went completely still. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the bikers on the floor and the slow creak of the front door swinging shut. The glow of red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, hands hovering over their holsters. Behind them, a few more cops stood by their squad cars, their radios crackling. "Hands where we can see 'em," the lead officer repeated, his voice firm. The seal didn't move at first. He stood tall, calm, his hands resting at his sides. Then, slowly, he raised them, palms open, showing he wasn't a threat. He had been in enough tense situations to know how to de-escalate. The bikers weren't so composed. The one who had started it all, the leader, was still hunched over the bar counter, rubbing his sore wrist. His face twisted with frustration as he straightened up. "These guys jumped us," he shouted, motioning to his crew. "We were just mindin' our business, and this guy comes in here startin' trouble." One of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair, narrowed his eyes. He had been a cop for a long time. He had seen plenty of fights. He knew when someone was lying. His gaze shifted to the seal. "That true?" The seal met his eyes, but said nothing. He didn't need to. Instead, the bartender spoke up. "No, sir," he said, shaking his head. "That's not how it happened." The officer turned. "You saw everything?" The bartender nodded. "Saw it clear as day. This man," he pointed at the seal, "came in, sat down, ordered a drink. Didn't say a word to nobody. These guys started messin' with him. Kept pushin' and pushin' till one of 'em pulled a knife." The officers exchanged glances. The seal stood still, waiting. He had been through enough interrogations to know when to keep quiet. One of the officers turned to the bikers. "So, you're tellin' me you were just sittin' here, mindin' your own business, and this guy," he motioned toward the SEAL, "somehow took out half your crew?" The bikers looked at each other. None of them spoke. The officer sighed, running a hand down his face. He was tired. It had been a long shift, and now he had to deal with a bunch of bruised-up drunks who picked the wrong guy to mess with. Finally, he looked at the SEAL. "You got a name?" The SEAL reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open and handed over his ID. The officer's eyes scanned the name, then stopped. His brows lifted slightly. "You're military?" The SEAL nodded. "Retired." The officer stared at him for a long moment, then let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains a lot." One of the younger officers leaned over, taking a look at the ID. His eyes widened. "Wait a second," he looked up at the SEAL, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to admiration. "You're a SEAL?" A murmur rippled through the bar. Some of the patrons exchanged glances. A few of them, who had been quietly watching from their tables, suddenly looked a lot more interested in the man who had just taken down a group of bikers like it was nothing. The lead officer handed the wallet back. "You got a permit to carry?" The SEAL shook his head. "Didn't need a weapon." The officer huffed a quiet chuckle. "I can see that." The bikers were still fuming. The leader, now standing with his arms crossed, glared at the officers. "So what? You just gonna let him walk? We got jumped, and you're taking his side?" The officer turned to him unimpressed. "You pulled a knife on a veteran in a bar fight and got your ass handed to you. That about sum it up?" The biker's jaw tightened. His friend shifted uncomfortably. The officer shook his head. "You boys got records?" The room tensed again. The biker hesitated. That was all the confirmation the officer needed. He turned to his partner. "Run their names. See what pops up." One of the younger officers stepped outside, radioing dispatch. A few moments later, his radio crackled back with a response. "Got a hit on 2 of 'em," the voice on the radio said. "Pending warrants. Assault charges." The officer let out a slow breath. "Well, ain't that something, Dot?" The biker stiffened. The officer motioned to his team. "Cuff 'em." The younger officers stepped forward, snapping handcuffs onto the wrists of 2 of the bikers. They didn't resist, there was no point. The fight had already drained them. The rest of the crew stood frozen, watching their friends get hauled toward the door. The lead officer turned back to the SEAL. "You want to press charges?" The SEAL looked at the bikers. He could see it now, the anger, the bruised egos, the quiet fear creeping in. He shook his head. "Not worth my time." The officer nodded. "Figured you'd say that." The bikers glared at him as their friends were led outside. The leader hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but then just looked away. The SEAL took one last look around the bar. The fight was over. The night had ended exactly as he had expected. He stepped toward the door. But just as he was about to leave, the bartender called out. "Hey." The SEAL paused, glancing over his shoulder. The bartender wiped down the counter, then gave him a nod. "Next drink's on the house." The SEAL considered it for a moment. Then, with a slight smirk, he shook his head. "Maybe next time." And with that, he walked out into the night. The night air was cool as the SEAL stepped out of the bar, the distant hum of police radios crackling from their squad cars. The flashing red and blue lights cast long shadows on the pavement, reflecting off the polished chrome of the parked motorcycles. He had been in situations like this before, outnumbered, underestimated, forced to prove himself without wanting to. But there was something different this time. Something unfinished. He could feel it. The officer who had questioned him earlier stepped outside, adjusting his belt. I gotta admit, he said, shaking his head, I don't see fights end like that too often. The seal didn't respond. The officer looked at him more closely now, as if trying to piece something together. You said you're retired? The seal nodded. The officer huffed. You don't seem like the kind of guy who just walks away from it all. The seal's eyes flickered toward the bar. Inside, the remaining bikers were gathering their pride, licking their wounds, muttering under their breath. He knew their type. They weren't the kind to let things go. Neither was he. The officer caught the glance and followed his gaze. He let out a tired sigh. They're gonna cause more trouble, aren't they? The seal didn't answer. Instead, he asked, what do you know about them? The officer exhaled through his nose, glancing over at the squad cars. More than I'd like, he muttered. We've been keeping an eye on them for months. They're not just some rowdy bikers. They run a racket in this town, illegal gambling, intimidation, drugs. The seal raised an eyebrow. The officer went on, voice lower now, almost cautious. The guy you put down in there? He nodded toward the bar. We've had him on our radar for a while. Goes by Reed. Got connections with some real bad people. That caught the seal's attention. The officer studied him again, as if weighing his next words. You didn't just walk into a random bar tonight, did you? For a moment, the seal didn't answer. Then, finally, he said, no. The officer gave a short laugh, more to himself than anyone else. Thought so. He rubbed his chin, considering something. I don't suppose you're here on official business? The seal shook his head. Not anymore. The officer glanced back at the bar, then at his fellow officers, who were loading the arrested bikers into the squad car. He exhaled, hands on his hips. Listen, he said, lowering his voice, I don't know what brought you here, and I don't need to know. But if you've got unfinished business with these guys, he paused. You're not the only one who wants to see them taken down. The seal considered this. This was supposed to be simple. A quiet drink. A moment to reflect. But trouble had a way of finding him. Or maybe, deep down, he had come looking for it. He looked at the officer. What do you need? The officer hesitated, then spoke carefully. A man like you? You could go places we can't. Hear things we don't. He sighed, glancing at the bar one last time. We need proof. Something solid to take them down for good. The seal nodded slowly. The fight in the bar had been nothing but a test. A warning. And he knew exactly how men like Reed operated. They wouldn't forget tonight. They wouldn't just let this go. But neither would he. Stay out of trouble, the officer muttered, giving him a knowing look before heading back to his squad car. The seal stood there for a moment, watching as the police drove off, the night falling silent once more. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked back toward the bar. If they were going to come for him, he wouldn't run. He would be waiting. The seal pushed the bar door open and stepped back inside. The atmosphere had changed. The music still played, the glasses still clinked, but the air was different, charged, expectant. The remaining bikers tensed at his return. They weren't used to seeing someone who wasn't afraid of them. Especially not someone who had just put 3 of their men on the ground like it was nothing. Reed, the leader, sat at the table near the corner. His lip was split, his knuckles bruised, but his eyes burned with something more dangerous than rage, humiliation. The seal walked back to the bar, nodding at the bartender, who hesitated before pouring him another drink. A few of the other patrons were still stealing nervous glances in his direction. Reed exhaled sharply, standing up. The wooden chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back. So that's it, huh? He muttered, cracking his neck. You come in here, start trouble, then walk around like you own the place? The seal took a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down. I didn't start anything, he said, his voice calm. Reed let out a bitter chuckle. You think you're untouchable? His voice was lower now, more controlled, but still laced with anger. You think we don't got people watching? You think we don't got friends and places that matter? The SEAL didn't react. He had dealt with men like Reed before, men who thrived on intimidation, who built their power on fear. But fear was a weapon that only worked on the weak. And he wasn't weak. Reed leaned in slightly. You got no idea what you just stepped into. The SEAL finally looked at him. Then tell me. Reed smirked, his confidence returning. You think you put a dent in my crew? You think the cops talking a few of my boys matters? He scoffed. That's just business. But now? He pointed a finger at the SEAL's chest. Now it's personal. The SEAL could feel the shift. This wasn't just about a bar fight anymore. It was about reputation. About control. And Reed needed to win. I got guys, Reed continued. Real guys. You? You're alone. The SEAL didn't blink. He took another sip of his drink. You sure about that? Reed frowned. The bar door swung open again. The officer from earlier stepped inside, followed by 2 more men. But these weren't just local cops. Their posture, their alert eyes, the way they scanned the room, they were feds. And they were here for one reason. Reed's face darkened. What the hell is this? The officer smirked. Well, Reed, turns out when we ran those warrants, we found something interesting. A whole lot of interesting. One of the federal agents pulled out a folder, flipping it open. We've been watching you for a while, Reed, he said, his tone cool and professional. Illegal firearms, trafficking, money laundering. Didn't have enough to move in before. The agent's eyes flickered to the SEAL. But now? We do. Reed's hands clenched into fists. He looked between the officers and the SEAL, realizing, too late, that he had walked into his own trap. You set me up, he muttered, voice low and venomous. The SEAL gave the smallest of smirks. You set yourself up. The officer stepped forward. Reed Johnson, you're under arrest. The feds moved in fast. Reed tried to back away, but there was nowhere left to run. His friends didn't move to help. They knew better. Within seconds, his hands were behind his back, cuffs clicking into place. You have the right to remain silent, the agent started. Reed glared at the SEAL as they led him toward the door. This ain't over, he hissed. The SEAL watched him go. Yes, it is. The door swung shut behind them, and just like that, it was over. The bartender let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Well, damn. The SEAL picked up his glass, finishing the last sip. The room was quiet, the bikers who remained frozen in place, their leader gone, their power broken. He stood, placed a few bills on the counter, and turned toward the door. Hey! The bartender called after him. The SEAL stopped. The bartender nodded toward the empty seat at the bar. I meant it. Next drinks on the house. The SEAL considered it for a moment. Then, with a small smile, he shook his head. Maybe next time. And with that, he walked into the night, knowing justice had been served. The night air was crisp as the SEAL stepped out of the bar for the last time. The red and blue lights had faded, and the street had returned to its usual quiet hum. But inside, the world had changed. Reed was gone. The gang was broken. And the town? It would remember this night for a long time. The SEAL walked down the sidewalk, his pace steady, his mind calm. He had seen justice served before, but this time was different. This wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a war zone. It was just another quiet town, another place where men like Reed thought they could rule through fear. And men like him? They made sure that fear didn't win. As he reached his truck, a voice called out behind him. Hey, man. He turned. It was the bartender. The older man jogged up to him, his breath visible in the cold air. "Listen," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say, thanks." The seal gave a small nod. "For what?" The bartender let out a dry laugh. "For everything. For standing up to those guys. For not letting them win." He shook his head. "Guys like Reed? They've had a grip on this town for years. People were scared. Always looking the other way." The seal studied him. "And you?" The bartender exhaled slowly. "I guess I did too. Until tonight." There was a silence between them. Then, the bartender spoke again, his voice quieter. "You ever think about sticking around?" The seal let out a small breath. He had been asked that before. Sticking around. Putting down roots. But men like him didn't get that luxury. He shook his head. "Not my kind of town." The bartender nodded, like he already knew the answer. "Figured you'd say that." The seal glanced back at the bar, then at the street ahead. "You don't need me here," he said after a moment. "Reed's gone. His crew will scatter. Someone else will try to take his place, but they won't be as bold. Not after tonight." The bartender frowned. "You sure about that?" The seal turned to him fully. "Fear doesn't last," he said simply. "But respect does." The bartender took that in. He looked back at the bar, then at the street, as if seeing it with new eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. The seal reached for the truck door, but before he got in, the bartender spoke again. "You ever need a place to come back to," he said, "you'll always have a seat at my bar." The seal gave him one last look. Then, with a small nod, he climbed into the truck. The engine rumbled to life. The bartender stepped back, watching as the truck rolled forward, the taillights glowing red before fading into the distance. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, the weight of the night settling over him. Then, finally, he turned and walked back inside. The bar was quiet. The bikers who were left sat stiffly, their leader gone, their fear fading into uncertainty. The bartender picked up a glass, wiped it down, then looked around the room. For the first time in a long time, he felt like this place belonged to him again. And maybe, just maybe, so did the town.